Hello. So, I'm Robert Ellis, and I'm starting this series of talks about the Buddha's Middle Way, which reflect and draw on my book, which is illustrated next to me here. Hello. The Buddha's Middle Way. So, I'm Robert Ellis, and the other thing I have to mention is that I'm finding my way through this streaming software, so if something goes wrong, like it did just then, you'll have to bear with me, at least to start with. Okay, so, yeah, about myself perhaps a little bit, for those who don't know me. So I'm the founder of the Middle Way Society, and I've written about 20 books on the theme of the Middle Way. So the Buddha's Middle Way is a book that was published in 2019 by Equinox, and it was really an attempt to apply the Middle Way to the Buddha, so to relate ideas about the Middle Way which I've developed from a variety of sources, including Buddhism obviously, over the years, particularly in relation to the Buddha as a source of inspiration for the Middle Way. So you'll notice the unusual way round there, yeah? That the Buddha way, the Middle Way came first there in a sense. So that reflects the approach I'm taking in this series of talks. So obviously it is very much about the Buddha, that is Siddhartha Gautama, this guy who lived in the northeastern Indian subcontinent about 2,500 years ago. Probably best described as a legendary figure, yeah? So he's a richly symbolic, important, inspirational figure in a historical setting. So he's legendary in that sense. But I'm approaching him as a source of inspiration primarily. Inspiration, also example, and method. So we can learn a lot from the Buddha about how to practice. What I'm going to try and avoid doing, which I've often come across in at least some parts of the Buddhist tradition, is to appeal to the authority of the Buddha. So by appealing to authority, I mean assuming that a particular source has the whole story, has an absolutely correct position. And if you appeal to authority, then not only do you assume that your source has everything right, you assume that you've got it all right in the way that you interpret them. So I think doing that with the Buddha is at odds with actually the Buddha's insights. So I think the insights come first, if you like, and the Middle Way comes first. And appealing to authority is very much associated with group identification and ideology and power and so on. Now we can't entirely escape those things. Groupiness is part of humanity, but we can reduce it and the conflicts that come with it. So it's the Buddha is a prompt for reflection and inspiration for us as individuals and as groups as well. Groups don't have to be groupy, in a sense. They don't have to be driven by power or absolute authority. So, by saying that I'm taking the Middle Way first in approaching the Buddha, I'm talking about the Middle Way as basically as a path of practice which adapts to the human situation, the situation of uncertainty and of being embodied, of being a human being in the difficult experiences we keep encountering in our lives. So the Middle Way is the approach that's best suited to dealing with all the conditions we meet. It's a general attempt to describe what is the best universal practice in the way that we approach things, in the way that we judge things from moment to moment. Obviously that has to be a provisional account, because we're not claiming to have got everything right. It's under constant development. But to be under constant development, it has to avoid getting shut down at any point by absolute assumptions. So to keep it open and provisional, I think it's necessary to avoid appeals to authority. So the middle way is something we keep encountering in experience. So rather than just starting with the Buddha, I'm just going to say a little bit about how we experience the middle way, just to try and give you a sense of it to start with. Yeah, so supposing you're trying to practice meditation. Now, you may have tried meditation and had this sense, oh, I can't do it, this is too difficult. Maybe you got distracted and then thought, that's it, I'm going away. Now that's kind of one absolute view of meditation. Another is to think, oh, this is easy, and for it not to really bite, to be overconfident. Okay, so if I've got to find a middle way there, you've got to balance your effort in relation to meditation. Or if you have certain beliefs about a, say, politician, do you think you've got the whole picture about that person? Are you absolutely correct in what you think about them? Or on the other hand, are you so unconfident that you really believe that what you believe is false, or that it's not worth thinking? So again, there's the middle way is where you've got that confident, justified, but nevertheless provisional view of things. Whether it's an internal thing like meditation, or whether it's even in the political world or in your profession or whatever it is, wherever you're making judgments of any kind. So putting the middle way first in relation to the Buddha recognizes really that the Buddha is an ambiguous and contested figure. Yeah, so we've got lots and lots of records which claim to be records of the Buddha, particularly the Pali Canon, a body of scriptures which has been handed down by the Theravada tradition. It's been subject to long transmission over millennia, translation, and most importantly interpretation. So it's a very, very complex path that this load of words has taken to reach us. But even then, we've still got to interpret it. It's our responsibility to relate it to our lives if that's what we're trying to do. So what I'm doing is, it's not typical Buddhist scholarship, in the sense I'm not seeking an authoritative account of the Buddha on historical or traditional grounds. I'm just trying to work on the basis of a credible and meaningful account of the Buddha. But I am trying to find a practically helpful account of the Buddha and to put that first. And I find that practically helpful account in the Pali Canon as a reasonable interpretation, not an absolutely proven interpretation, not the only interpretation, but a reasonable interpretation in the Pali Canon. And I think we can use that account as a source of inspiration in the practice of the middle way. And again, it's not the only possible source of inspiration, but it is a major one that needs to be recognised. So the middle way focuses on what's practically helpful. It's avoiding immediate errors in the form of absolute assumptions on either side. Now, how that relates to the Buddha's life, I will explain in a minute. But so it involves leaving aside or rejecting particularly assumptions that are unhelpful, and working with what we've got. So in the case of thinking about the Buddha, that means working with commonly accepted accounts and investigating what they mean for us and how they can be helpful to us. So for that reason, I only go into scholarly concerns to a reasonable extent. So I'm not going to take it as an end in itself to mine out what this or that Sanskrit or Pali word means or any of that stuff beyond the point where it becomes of immediate practical helpfulness. So yes, I am taking the account of the Buddha's life as we get it in the established translations that people widely use in the West in English. And so that's the account we're working with, if you like. Not that there aren't any issues with that account, but I'm not going to go into them particularly in these talks. So what I am going to go into is the meaning of the Buddha and how the Buddha can inspire us. And in this talk now, I'm going to start with the Buddha's early life, because the Buddha's early life is particularly, well, I think one of the most striking of the world's stories, really, and one of the most archetypally inspiring of the world's great stories. By his early life, I mean the period before the Buddha really found the middle way, or allegedly found enlightenment. So I'm concerned with that initial period, which is structured really by two phases which we could call the palace and the forest. There are other labels you could give them, but those are the two phases of it. So the story of the Buddha's early life, starting off with his life as a prince in a palace, or at least a noble person, a person of high rank in privileged circumstances. That's a story which symbolises a general process of development towards the middle way that I think we can all relate to and all make use of. That symbolisation of the Buddha and what the early life means, I think will be just as strong, certainly for me, if it turned out to be a work of fiction. So its historicity, as far as I'm concerned, would make no difference to its practical helpfulness. And I think that's the implication. If you don't appeal to the authority of a historical narrative or historical revelation of some kind, then really you have to accept that if it was fiction, it's jolly powerful fiction, and it's still just as valuable. And I think that's a bit reinforced by the tradition itself, because the Buddhist tradition, as it's recorded in the Pali Canon, it's actually not just about Siddhartha Gautama. It's also about a series of Buddhas. So the accounts of the early life of the Buddha are actually not just about Siddhartha Gautama. So there's also an account of an earlier Buddha in the series of Buddhas called Vipassi, and a lot of the traditional account of the Buddha's life is actually Vipassi, if you look at the Pali Canon account. So the idea of there being a series of Buddhas fits in with the idea of there being a lot of different aeons, so a whole age which has a Buddha, and then there's a breakdown, and then there's a new age which needs another Buddha, and so on. And this takes unimaginable lengths of time. And what that suggests to me, in terms of what's practically helpful to us, rather than speculative, is the universality of the story. Yeah, that it's not just about one bloke, it's not just about one person in one particular time and place. It's about how we can develop. Okay, so let's go on then to some of the narrative of the early life of the Buddha. So, going on to the story of what I will call a palace, for lack of a better way of talking about it. So, the stories of the Buddha's life in the palace suggest a very protected, lavish environment. And I'm just going to read you a short passage which is quoted in my book from the Pali Canon, from the Anguttara Nikaya, about the Buddha's life in the palace. So basically I'm drawing on what the earliest accounts that we have, which give a particular coherent idea of the Buddha's life, and this is one of them. So I was delicately brought up, O monks, this is the Buddha speaking. Highly delicate, exceedingly delicate was my upbringing. At my father's house, lotus ponds were made. In one of them blue lettuces bloomed, in another white lettuces, and in a third red lettuces, just for my enjoyment. I used only sandal unguent from Benares, and my headdress, my jacket, my undergarment and my tunic were made of Benares muslin. By day and night a white canopy was held over me, lest cold and heat, chaff or dew should trouble me. I had 3 palaces, one for the summer, one for the winter, and one for the rainy season. In the palace for the rainy season, during the 4 months of the rains, I was waited upon by female musicians only. And I did not come down from the palace during these months. While in other people's homes, servants and slaves receive a meal of broken rice together with sour gruel, in my father's house they were given choice rice and meat. Okay, so we just get an impression there of a pampered, secure life, which is not that different from many of our lives in some respects, I think. Obviously, you're not talking about everybody here. Many of you listening to this may have quite hard lives, I don't know. But many people in the West have relatively secure lives. Even some people in the developing world who are better off have relatively secure lives. So think of the 3 palaces. Okay, most of us don't have 3 palaces, but we do have the chance to move to different places and a change of scene and stay in a different place, which is quite comfortable. We go on holiday. The passage talks about having servants to do everything. Most of us don't have servants these days, but we do have machines that do all sorts of things which were inconceivable in the Buddha's time. So those are our servants in effect. And the Buddha talks about female musicians, which is a rather ambiguous phrase which suggests sensual entertainment, I think, in that context. Now, what sensual entertainment means could mean anything from obviously just music to something very sexual. It's difficult to tell, isn't it? But obviously that kind of entertainment is readily available in our lives as well, even if we're just talking about pop videos and movies and so on. So a lot of the comfort and protection of the Buddha's life is familiar to us, I think, in some ways, or for many of us. And that comfort is based on having all your basic needs met so that you can enjoy some of the ones higher up the pyramid, as it were, if you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy. So that's led to the traditional idea that the palace represents self-indulgence, and it's the extreme of self-indulgence. Now that's one aspect of it, but there's another important aspect as well, I think, which is the absolute beliefs that accompany that kind of situation. So when people have that kind of status and that kind of security as a group, then they want to defend it. And so that leads to the belief that they want to promulgate and to spread and to maintain through power that this way of life is natural and necessary and other people should maintain it for them. And that can be ideologically supported. As Marxists would point out, I think it's one of the insights of Marxism that ideology helps to support social interests, basically. So absolutism and relativism and conventionalism all go with that, defending that social status, that socio-economic status. So you could claim, for example, that the cosmic order gives you that place, which very much fits in with traditional Indian understanding of the social hierarchy, which turns into the caste system. You can also have a relativist way of defending it. So, this is what's right for us, even if what's right for you is different. Yeah. So, what's right for us, privileged princes in our palaces, may not be right for you, servants eating your rule. But we're going to maintain our standing. And that even continues, even if you're being generous to the servants, as was the case in the passage I read. They're fed choice rice and meats, but that's still kind of paternalism, isn't it? It's still maintaining your status. Okay, so, and also the Buddha in the stories about his life in the palace is very isolated. And the story traditionally goes, particularly as it developed, that he was isolated from any understanding of suffering. Now, that may seem very like an exaggeration to us, but it reflects also something that we could get into, which is, well, if you think about the echo chamber effect on social media and the the tendency to be surrounded by people who have the same views as you, who will just reflect what you believe. And that's very likely to be the case, of course, if you're in a powerful position. So the Buddha, as well as being pampered, doesn't seem to have been challenged much in his early life in the palace. So that reflects a particular, perhaps, limitation in our own lives. Now, the time in the palace is ended when the Buddha goes forth. So there are various traditional depictions of the idea of going forth, which have become very important in the Buddhist tradition. And I'll show you one of the pictures of this. One of the earliest accounts actually is of what's called the three considerations. So the Buddha either thinks of or perhaps encounters an old man, a sick man, and a corpse. Now, the way this is presented, I think, in what are probably the earlier accounts in the Pali Canon, is more about actually looking beyond your absolute assumptions. Your assumptions about the lack of those things. So your assumptions about youth and health and life. So obviously your assumptions about youth, for instance, are going to be challenged if you meet somebody who's aged. Let me just read you again a passage. This again is from the Anguttara Nikaya, about the Buddha's first stirrings of changing his view of things, the three considerations as they're called. So amidst such splendour and an entirely carefree life, O monks, this thought came to me: an uninstructed worldling, though sure to become old himself and unable to escape aging, feels repelled, humiliated or disgusted when seeing an old and decrepit person, being forgetful of his own situation. Now I too am sure to become old and cannot escape aging. If, when seeing an old and decrepit person, I were to feel repelled, humiliated or disgusted, that would not be proper for one like myself. When I reflected thus, monks, all my pride in youthfulness vanished. Okay, so this is how it seems to be presented at first. It's the recognition that youthfulness isn't everything. You can't just take it for granted, and you can't be repelled. You have no business to be repelled by age because it's part of the conditions you're working with. And the same applies to in parallel to the sick man and the corpse. But that later turns into what you can see in the picture, which is the story of the Buddha going out in his chariot. Here he's accompanied by lots and lots of people, and seeing an old man, a sick man, and a corpse, which you can just about see in the background there in that picture. So we have the three considerations, but so that then develops into the four sights, as they're called. So in the story of Vipassy, later on, well, it's actually supposed to be an earlier Buddha, there's a fourth sight. There's also what is known as a shramana, a religious mendicant, who offers an alternative to the three considerations, to an alternative to old age, sickness, and death. But either way, he's shaken up. So whether he's shaken up by a series of reflections or by an experience of seeing something or seeing some things, whatever it is, the Buddha encounters difficulty. He encounters what's often translated as suffering, but basically it's recognizing that he hasn't got the whole story. That's the key thing, I think, here. And that results in a dramatic rejection of his situation. So the Buddha goes to the opposite extreme, that is, of no longer being a prince, but of becoming a religious mendicant, a complete dropout from the society he was brought up in. So this is another traditional depiction of that. The picture shows the Buddha looking in at his sleeping wife and her servants, saying goodbye to them. Yeah, so he doesn't want to wake them up to disturb them. He's just creeping out, but he wants to take one last look before he leaves them. So he leaves everything, and according to traditional depictions, he cuts his hair and he takes off all his ornaments and so on, and becomes a homeless religious wanderer. So if you try and think of a modern day parallel to that, maybe think about somebody who's perhaps had a very privileged youth. Perhaps they've brought up in a rich household and they've gone to Oxford or Harvard or somewhere, and they have every expectation of having a world-breaking career in a high-flying profession. But while they're still at Harvard, say, then they drop out and they go and join a commune or something, or they even become homeless. They go to the opposite end of society. They defeat all the expectations with which they were brought up. So it's as dramatic as that. Now, obviously, to do that, you've got to idealise what you're going into. So the text very much idealise what it is to be a shramana, to be a religious mendicant at that point, which represents the religious life as a whole as an alternative to what's seen as the worldly life. But what the Buddha's doing here, which I think is important for us, is he's starting to apply skepticism. He's beginning to recognise uncertainty about the things that he's previously believed. At this point, he's still doing it very one-sidedly. So he's idealising the Shramanas, perhaps, and he's not applying the same skepticism to the life of the Shramana. He's not thinking ahead, perhaps, as to what the drawbacks might be of the life in the forest, or the limitations of it. He's embracing it wholeheartedly as the alternative, which will deal with the things that he thinks need dealing with. So, like a lot of us, he's swinging from one extreme to the other. That may be a necessary process for us to go through. Indeed, developmental psychology suggests perhaps that it might well be a necessary process to go through. That we swing from one extreme to the other before perhaps gradually reaching some kind of equilibrium. So rather like a pendulum that's coming gradually to a stop, you swing one way, then you swing the other way, and then gradually the oscillations reduce, perhaps. And I've noticed patterns like that in my own life, of swinging from one extreme to another, and then maybe the next time, if I get a little bit wiser, then the extremes of the oscillation become a bit less each time. So we're gradually settling into something which is more like the middle way, perhaps, eventually. But in order to do that, we've got to have the first swing. So in order to do that, in order to leave your situation, and remember, this is not just about leaving self-indulgence and being renunciant. It's also about giving up everything you believe and everything around you, everybody around you is reinforced constantly throughout your life. It's giving up all that. That's requires an enormous amount of courage. So again, to think of some parallels, think of maybe a woman who's been in an abusive marriage for 30 years, gathers the courage to leave it. Or maybe a priest who's invested their whole career in the church and then suddenly decides and realises it's a sham. He renounces these beliefs. Or maybe a whistleblower in a company who finds unethical practices and is prepared to reveal those practices to the world. These actions involve going against what everyone else is telling you in the context, and having confidence in your own judgment instead. And of course, you're going to exaggerate that. You're going to find it really difficult to find balance in that situation. You just got to get out of that situation. So that, I think, is the background to the difficulties a lot of people might have with the going forth, because the Buddha abandons his family, as the picture suggests. And basically, in order to avoid the overwhelming power of the originating ideology where we are, it may be necessary to make a decisive break. That doesn't mean, I don't think, that we have to completely rationalise what the Buddha did, because it's part of a messy context. So everything to do with the middle way and finding it and working towards it is messy. And so I don't think it's, in fact, it's quite important not to expect the Buddha to be morally perfect according to a set of rules that we might be applying to his conduct. So no, he's not a perfect husband. He leaves his wife apparently without consulting her even, although she is obviously well provided for. But the Buddha doesn't have to be morally perfect. He's just symbolising a process that we might need to go through, which might take a very different form, obviously, in our own context. Nevertheless, he symbolises that process quite powerfully. Okay, let's move on then from the palace and the going forth to the forest. So, in the forest, the Buddha goes into a completely different context, where there are a different set of cultural norms, a different set of assumptions. People live in a completely different way. He's perhaps doing. If you think of a similar situation for us in our circumstances, there may be all sorts of places which are forests for us, where we can get away from the overwhelming expectations of our normal lives, little spaces. So whether you go on retreat, or whether you just go to the countryside and go for a walk, places like churches or art galleries or even bedrooms might have that role for us, of a different space. But obviously for the Buddha, a whole culture went with what it was to go into the forest. So it was more powerful than that. So the Buddha, first of all, went through a process of adapting to the new cultural norms, the basically religious cultural norms of the forest. And we can start off thinking about the role of his teachers. Sorry, this is not quite working as I hoped. Anyway, you can see a picture of the Buddha's, traditional depiction of the Buddha's meeting with Alara Kalama, who is the first of his teachers. The second one was Uddaka Ramaputta. So, according to the stories, he successively was taught by both of these different teachers. Now, whether they wore orange robes or anything like that is another matter, but again, we can see the significance of the need for him to be taught, to have some sort of structure from which he learns, where he learns particularly perhaps some background intellectual structure, but also particularly religious practice, including particularly meditation. But the Buddha is, after a short while, not entirely satisfied with what he gets from these two teachers. So the same thing happens with each of them successively. And what happens with each of them is that these teachers think they've got a whole view of things, that they are enlightened, or they have a right view, a revealed total view of things. But in the traditional Buddhist understanding, all they've attained is the higher jhanas. So they've attained particularly subtle, refined mental states, but they haven't actually attained anything beyond that. Now, the equivalent to that, I think, in many other circumstances, is something that's very common today, and indeed throughout the ages, which is people having a spiritual experience or religious experience of some kind, and assuming that experience, which is incredibly valuable and meaningful to them, maybe transforms their lives, but insisting that is a revelation from God, or a perfect message, or a metaphysical truth, or something like that. So thinking they have the whole story because they've had this transformative experience. But an experience is not the same as getting a set of words which are true. That's the important insight of the skeptical perspective. And that doesn't devalue the value of spiritual experiences at all, I think. So what those teachers seem to have fallen into is something that many other people have fallen into as well, which is to assume that they have metaphysical certainties, that they have the truth about things, and then that of course becomes the basis of status, the basis of a religious group, where people believe in those truths and follow and identify with the group because of their beliefs. But in each case, the Buddha recognized that. He learnt from the teachers, he appreciated what they had to teach him, but he then moved on because he realized that they weren't telling the whole story. And I think it's important to treat the Buddha himself similarly to this. Now, that's something I'm not going to elaborate on now, but it will come out in the next talk, which is about the middle way and enlightenment, the idea of enlightenment. Okay, but let's move on from the teachers to the ascetics. So the other phase of the Buddha's time in the forest is the ascetics and ascetic practices. So again, this is a Theravadan depiction of, well, actually the Buddha leaving behind the group of ascetics that he fell in with. So the ascetics are performing austerities on themselves, such as burning themselves, spiking themselves, starving themselves, and indeed the Buddha did the same sorts of things. And you see statues of the starving Buddha depicting really his participation in those austerities. So what the ascetics believed was that the practice of austerity produced merit. So if you inflict pain on yourself, then because of the operation of karma or of cosmic justice of some kind, your merits will be rewarded in the future. So you will get rewards in the future because of, as it were, the merit you have saved up in the cosmic bank. You can draw it out later, maybe in a successive life. So that's really, it's the underlying attitude there is that of repression, alienation, or at least deferred gratification. So there are lots of different versions of that we can encounter in Western civilization. It's not often we find people lying on beds of nails or whatever, but we do get people who are driven by work or a sense of duty, for example, people who get very alienated. I used to teach teenagers. Teenagers in classrooms can be incredibly alienated from their context. The early development of capitalism was very driven by asceticism, in the sense that people constantly deferred their gratification. They would work incredibly hard, and they didn't want the results of their work yet. They just kept investing and investing and investing because they expected greater rewards in the future, but they never actually paused to enjoy the results of their labours. Now that's less the case now, but there are still obviously veins of asceticism in Western culture. Along with that went the belief in a true self, that needs to be imposed on the false self. So the willful self that believes it's really you that is earning the merit, which is imposing itself on the recalcitrant body, on the desires of the body, and will be rewarded. So that true self is the one that will be rewarded, obviously. It's a very depressing, divisive, conflicting view of oneself, really. But it's one that's widely found in many ideologies. So the Buddha apparently participated in this fully, but then recognised the limitations of it. So the crucial point where he got beyond this way of thinking was the recognition of the middle way. And so the middle way is the obviously the climax of what I want to talk about here, how the Buddha discovered the middle way, but he can only have reached the middle way through the process he's gone through already, through the palace and the forest as the extreme alternatives. And his discovery of the middle way was apparently triggered by memory of the episode under the rose apple tree. Again, you'll find that quoted in my book, and I'm just going to read you the passage concerned. So traditionally this is seen as the point where the Buddha was meditating at a festival, a ploughing festival. So this is depicted here. So on the left here in this picture you can see behind a screen, almost in this depiction, the Buddha is sitting in meditation under a tree, and then there were lots of people ploughing in the rest of the picture. So that's one way in which people have envisaged it in the Buddhist tradition. So I'll read you the passage. So I recall that when my father the Sakyan was occupied, while I was sitting in the cool shade of a rose apple tree, quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states, I entered upon and abided in the first jhana, which is accompanied by applied and sustained thought, with rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. Okay, so the Buddha recalled a state of jhana, a state of meditative absorption, which I think importantly is a mindful state. Yeah, so a state of jhana is a state where you have succeeded in becoming mindful, basically, and become stable in that state, and you've begun to really enjoy it. So the first jhana is an embodied state. Anyone who's practiced mindfulness will know that you need to become aware of your body, to settle into your body, to accept it in order to become mindful. And so I find it very interesting that the point where the Buddha recognizes the middle way, he's been through this incredibly alienating ascetic practice where he's been trying to get away from his body and punish his body and eliminate his body almost. And then suddenly he realizes through this memory, which relates back to the palace, that actually his body is at the basis of the pyramid, that meeting the needs of his body is the basis of any other achievements that he might make. This jhana experience is embodied and it's temporarily at least integrated. He's got a sense of how he could be satisfied, content in his body. And this is this recognition of the needs of his body is symbolized by him accepting food. This is depicted again traditionally in all sorts of ways. But there was a woman passing by who happened to be carrying some rice or rice porridge, which she gave to the Buddha. This could be very symbolic, I think, of the moment of recognizing the middle way. I'd like to see this maybe as a kind of Buddhist Eucharist, this moment of recognizing that you have a body and your body has needs. It's incredibly basic and could be the kind of Buddhist parallel, I think, to the bread and wine in Christianity. Maybe having a sacrament of rice porridge, but that would all be symbolic, of course. Yes, so the Buddha eats. He's meeting his bodily needs, and he's starting with bodily awareness. To that embodied realization at the basis of the middle way, I think today we could also add another element, which is embodied meaning. So that's a much more recent development, particularly from two thinkers who have very much influenced me, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, who have developed an embodied understanding of meaning. And I'm not going to go into any depth in that at all now, but perhaps just to try to get to the heart of it, it's that meaning is about making connections in our bodily experience. In our bodies themselves as well, of course, but just thinking about it in bodily experience. Think about our brains making neural connections, not just our brains actually, but whole bodies, but particularly our brains making neural connections whenever we understand anything new. So making connections, not making a picture or representation out of words that represents reality or doesn't. So that's the obsession that humans so often get caught up in. The belief that their words describe how things are or don't. But that's not really how words work. They get their meaning from their connections in our experience, developed through our lives. So I think all that is consistent with the Buddha's key recognitions there of the vital importance of his body to the way forward at this point. So as he finds the middle way, he unites the helpful elements of the palace and the forest. You could say the bodily basis of the palace, in acceptance of some aspects of the body in the palace, and the universal aspiration of the forest, that the forest is trying to move beyond the limitations of the palace. That's a duality that's reflected in all sorts of ways, or could be parallel to all sorts of dualities in human thought in other ways. For example, idealism and realism, or idealism and materialism, or empiricism and rationalism. So lots and lots of such dualities. But whatever the duality is, the middle way needs to recognise those dualities, but not accept their limiting division, not accept the frame which leaves you stuck in that division. So the middle way also reframes, so it questions the assumption that makes the extremes conflict with each other, and it takes its understanding of conditions from both. Now the two mules picture quite well illustrates that for me. So I think the two mules, which is a picture from used by pacifists in pacifist campaigns. I think it originally comes from Aesop's fables. Just very strongly illustrates that process. So you've got the mules in conflict with each other because they are framing things in a particular way. They are assuming that they must eat those two different bales of hay, and they just get into conflict as long as they stay in that frame. But when they reconsider and reframe, become aware of their circumstances, they begin to look at it differently, and they can then adopt a better way of fulfilling their desires in those circumstances, and they can integrate their desires. They can both get what they want, but on the basis of different assumptions. So that again, that's obviously not in the life of the Buddha, but it's I think a very helpful auxiliary way of thinking about what's happening when the Buddha discovers the middle way. You can think of that as happening in our psyches at each point where we discover the middle way for ourselves, and we have to not only discover it once but keep discovering it over and over again, in my experience. Okay, so the recognition of the middle way, in my opinion, is the supreme achievement of the Buddha in this symbolic story of his early life. So it's universal, it applies to all of us at each moment. It's not just about a specific culture or tradition or ideology, it's an approach to judgment, which seems to be applicable in every different circumstance for humans, as far as we can tell. Now, obviously we may yet discover exceptions to that, but I haven't found any. It seems to work as a general description of how we should lead our lives. So that's what's perhaps different about what I'm saying from traditional Buddhism. I'm not going to put a lot of emphasis on the Buddha's achievement of nirvana. Now, the issue of how we understand nirvana and how it compares with the middle way, how it relates to the middle way, is one I will expand on in my next talk, which is excuse me, in a week's time at 7 p.m. UK time on the 9th of May. Okay, so I've just got a little bit of time to answer questions there, if there are any. Let me have a look in the chat and see what I can say. So, that's the beginning. So I've got a question from Coffee Smug. Doesn't jhana require one-pointed attention, meaning that attention has to be focused like on the tip of the nose, because otherwise attention is too broad and not focused enough to reach jhana? Yes, I agree that jhana does require one-pointed attention. So it's not just, obviously jhana isn't just created by bodily awareness, but to sustain that bodily awareness you need one-pointed attention as well as embodied awareness. In order to maintain your meditative absorption, you will need to move between the broad and the narrow, if you like, between the one-pointed attention and the wider awareness, and that's actually quite a helpful way of dealing with distractions in meditation, in my experience, to sort of navigate between the two. That you, for example, if you're getting too passive, too sluggish perhaps, then you can focus more on the tip of your nose or more on one pointedness. And if you're getting too distracted, if you've got more sort of energized hindrance, then you can focus more on your body and on the more passive sort of experience of your body. So yeah, there's a constant navigation involved in meditation, I agree, between directing ourselves and directing our attention in accordance with our desires, in accordance with one particular set of beliefs as well, which go with those desires about what we should be doing, and on the other hand recognising the whole context in which we're working, and that's what another way of talking about what the middle way is about, really. So it's both having a particular set of desires, but which you constantly try to integrate, which you constantly try and make more adequate and put into contact with other desires, and obviously recognising the context in which you're working. Okay, so I've got a few more minutes if anyone else wants to ask any other questions. Just give it maybe one more minute for them to come through. We don't want any more at the moment that I can see. It doesn't look like there are any other questions. Okay, so anyway, we're near the end of the time. So just then to reiterate that this is the first of a series of 7 talks. So the next one will be on middle way and enlightenment, which will be on the 9th of May at 1900 UK time. Also, obviously, if you want any further information, references, anything else like that to explore in more depth what I'm talking about, it's all in the book, so obviously do take a look at that if you can. It's also now available in German for German speakers. Okay, so thanks to everyone who's been listening, and obviously if you do think of any questions that didn't occur to you at the time, then I'm very happy for you to get in touch with me. If you look at the Middle Way Society website, then you'll see how to do that, and you'll see lots of other information about the Middle Way. Okay, so that's it for now. Goodbye.